I've owned the Osmo Pocket 3 for about 6 months now, and this camera continues to impress me, especially with the ability of this camera to capture rather stunning cinematic footage. Now I know there's a lot of spirited debate over what constitutes cinematic, and I'm not going to get into all of that here, but I will say that in general, cinematic is footage that looks professional, and footage that looks like what you would see on the big screen if you go to a movie theater, something like that. Let's work with that with our definition of cinematic today. And in this video, I'm going to teach you everything that you need to know in order to capture that stunning cinematic footage with your Osmo Pocket 3. And this whole video will be organized with the table of contents below. If you need to skip ahead or go back and watch a section, the table of contents will make it nice and easy to do that. So one of the great things about the Osmo Pocket 3 is it's basically a gimbal with a camera built onto it. That gimbal does allow you to get really smooth footage. Getting that smooth footage is one of the characteristics of cinematic footage. Sure, there are times and places in movies where the footage is a little bit more rough, and that's usually because that's part of the storytelling process. But in general, footage in a movie, when the camera's moving, the camera's going to be nice and smooth. There may be a little bit of movement up and down or side to side, especially in intense scenes. But in general, that movement is going to be smooth. And this camera is well equipped for that with the mechanical stabilization. And unlike a lot of other cameras that are in this price range of around $500 to $600 or lower, a lot of those other cameras don't have mechanical stabilization. And because of that, you have to work with electronic image stabilization, which is much harder to work with because you have to have good lighting and you have to have a certain shutter speed. But with mechanical stabilization, you can pretty much pick whatever shutter speed you want to. And I'm going to get into the recommended shutter speed in frames per second a little bit later. So when it comes to filming that smooth footage, key thing that you have to be aware of when you're moving is you want to keep a nice gait where you do heel to toe. You don't want to just walk normal. So when you walk normal, there's going to be some bounce like this, and it's going to be obvious that you're walking. Now, for a lot of the sample clips I'm featuring in today's video, those were filmed while I was hiking. And of course, if I'm moving while hiking, there's going to be a good bit of that bounce. But even with some of that normal hiking, where I wasn't super careful, this does cushion a lot of that bounce, and it still makes it look pretty smooth. But there were other scenes where I did walk heel to toe, and that smoothness is extra nice. So keep it as smooth as possible when you can. That's going to definitely help the footage look more cinematic. And another key attribute of cinematic footage is how you frame your subject or whatever it is in your scene that you want to direct your audience's attention to. So for that, one of the important things is using the rule of thirds. So the nice thing about the Osmo Pocket 3 is you can turn the grid on and you can kind of use that to help you. But in general, in a scene, you're going to want to have somebody's eyes right there along the top third line. And if your subject is walking in a certain direction, you want to keep 2/3 of the frame in front of the direction they're walking in general. There can be exceptions to that depending on your story and what you're trying to tell. But in general, a good technique is to keep that 2/3 of the frame in front of your subject. And another key with framing is you don't have to be moving with this camera. The nice thing about the creator's kit with this, it does come with a battery extension and a little tripod. So the nice thing is if you're a solo creator, you can put it on that and you can stand it on the ground and you can aim the gimbal up at an angle you want to, or you can have it show your feet when you walk by, anything like that. So keep in mind that sometimes the best cinematography is a lot of stationary shots where the camera's not moving, but the action that's happening within the scene is moving. And if you look at a lot of movies or a lot of TV shows, in a lot of cases, more than half of the frames in that, the camera is stationary. There's no movement at all. Now, there may be that handheld movement appearance, especially in a lot of TV shows. Having that little bit of movement there isn't bad. And the third tip for good cinematography is making sure that you have the focus the way you want it to be. Now, the great thing about the Pocket 3 is it does have autofocus functionality, so you are able to get your subject in focus and have that blur in the background. Like right now with the camera I'm talking to, I'm in focus, but my background has a nice blur behind me. So right now in this frame, I am the subject of the frame, and this is my background around me. So with the Pocket 3, you can definitely select what you want in focus and what you don't want in focus. And you definitely want to use that to your advantage. You want to direct your audience attention where you want it to be as you tell your story. So the next section I want to delve into is I want to delve into the settings on here that are going to work best for that stunning cinematography. So let's talk about those key settings. Before I get into the specifics here, there are a couple general settings we want to make sure are set here. And the first one we want to make sure of is we want to select our gimbal here for gimbal modes. and we want to do tilt locked. Tilt locked is going to be key for cinematic footage. And another setting we want to change is under rotational speed. We want to select this to slow. That way, if you're going to be moving the gimbal at all to rotate it, you want it to be as slow as possible, because slow, smooth motion in general is going to look more cinematic. Now, if you have some type of fast-paced scene, then you might want to set this to default or fast if you're going to actually be rotating your gimbal. But in general, I recommend keeping it set to slow for the rotational speed. And then under the other settings here, you want to make sure the video compression is set to HEVC. It's going to give you the highest quality video, and that's going to be really important for the color profile that we want to use. And then another key setting, as I mentioned the rule of thirds earlier, is this reference line setting. You want to make sure it's set to grid. Grid is going to give you the lines, and that's going to help you frame your scene the way you want to. And you may not be able to see the grids with this camera right here, but there are gray lines that go across, 2 of them horizontal and 2 of them vertically. So first thing you'll want to do is you'll want to make sure you're in video mode. Once you're in video mode, you want to toggle up from the bottom. And right here for the resolution, make sure you have 4K. For the frames per second, it's really going to depend on preference here. But I will say a lot of the time, I just do 4K 60 because my finished product is going to be a 24 frames per second timeline. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to drop that footage on there. It'll conform perfectly to the 24 frames per second. But also, if I want to slow down that footage, I can slow it down to as much as 40% of the original speed, because it's 60 frames per second, and the slow motion will look really smooth. And there could be plenty of times in a cinematic project where you want the footage a little bit slower to emphasize something. But if you know for sure you're not going to want to slow it down at all, you could go to 4K 24 or 4K 25, depending upon what country you're in. And of course, there is also the 4K 30 option if you want to have footage that's slowed down slightly, or if your finished product is going to be 4K 30 for the timeline. Now, if you did do 4K 30 and dropped it onto a 24 frames per second timeline, your footage would be 80% of the original speed. And that is kind of a neat technique to use in certain situations that can look kind of cool, because it's not really slowed down so much that it's noticeable to the human eye, but it's kind of a more subtle effect. So I definitely recommend keeping that available as an option. But I'm going to put this back to 4K 60, and then up here, just make sure this is set to 16:9. 16:9 is going to be our finished product aspect ratio. Next parameter we're going to adjust is we're going to swipe left. And the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure Pro is selected up here. If Pro is not selected, you're going to have very limited options. So make sure you select Pro. And the first thing we're going to set right away is we're going to go to exposure. And you're going to want to make sure to select M down here. Now, for the shutter speed, you want to set this manually, and you want it to always be twice your frame rate. So in this case, my frame rate is 60 frames per second. Therefore, my shutter speed is going to be 1/120. If you were filming in 30 frames per second, then you'd want to do shutter speed of 1/60. And if you were in 24 frames per second, it would be 1/50. For the ISO over here, I recommend starting at 100. And we may have to fine tune this later on based on the EV setting. But right now, our exposure value up here is negative 0.3, which is about perfect for what we want. For the white balance, if you're outside and it's during the daytime, I recommend setting that to 5600K, and you want to select M here first so you can select that static value. 5600K is generally going to be a great daytime white balance. If you are filming at sunrise or sunset, then you'll want to set this to about 6500K. It's going to help you get really good looking white balance during that time. And for the glamour effect, keep that off. The glamour effect is not going to help you get cinematic footage. For the color profile, you've got a couple options, but I highly recommend D-Log M. D-Log M is relatively easy to work with. It is 10-bit footage, and it's going to give you a little bit flatter color profile that you can then selectively grade later on to get really good results. You can fine-tune the colors, the contrast, and the feel of the clip. And I'm going to, of course, show you how to do that later on as well. Then down here for the focus mode, I recommend doing continuous. Continuous is going to help that autofocus to adjust during your scene as you move your camera. But if you don't want the focus to change on you at all during your scene, then you want to select single right there. And basically what's going to happen is you're going to get your focus set up when you start recording that clip, and your focus is not going to change on you at all unless you change it. But I like to work with continuous. I find that works best. And then down here under the image adjustment, there's a couple key settings here. First one is sharpness. We want to set that to -2. -2 is going to give you the best looking footage. Cinematic footage is not overly sharp. You want that footage to be very low with the sharpness. And then with noise reduction, I recommend setting this at -1. That's going to have the Pocket 3 apply just a little bit of noise reduction internally, but not much at all. Now, if you want to do real advanced cinematography and you have a noise reduction tool that you can use when editing, there are some good plugins out there, then you could just do -2 right here, and the Pocket 3 is not going to apply any noise reduction at all. But I like to work with -1. I find that's the best balance, and unless I'm in really low light footage, I don't need to use noise reduction later on. And we're going to click confirm there. So what we have is we have a fully static exposure triangle. What that means is we have a static aperture. The built-in aperture in this camera, which I believe is f2, that's static. You can't change the aperture. But what we can change here is we can change the ISO and we can change the shutter speed. And we've set both of those to static values. That is one of the key aspects of cinematic footage. You don't want the exposure triangle changing on you, any of those variables during your scene. Simply having that static exposure value can really enhance the look of your footage and make it look a lot better as well. And if you're going from light to darkness and darkness to light, it kind of helps emphasize that even more, which some of these sample scenes here kind of show that when I walked through some darker patches of forest and then came out the other side in the light. It really helps show the lighting in that scene really well. So those are the core settings that I recommend for cinematic footage. But now it's time to talk about a couple tools that I recommend using. And the main tool that I recommend for getting really good cinematic footage is this 6-pack of filters right here from Freewell. This filter pack has some key filters for getting cinematic footage. In particular, this one right here, which is the anamorphic filter. You may or may not have heard of anamorphic before, but basically this is going to allow you to film a really cinematic looking scene, and there's going to be a couple reasons for that. One, the anamorphic is going to give you a slightly wider look to your frame, and at the same time it's also going to change the pixel shape. So it's going to make the pixel shape a little bit different than the normal stock video from this camera would look. And what it does is it changes the appearance of the footage. It's not necessarily something that you're going to consciously pick up, but subconsciously it's going to look a lot better. That bokeh is going to have a different shape to it, and it's going to look really good. The shape of that bokeh is going to be more oval. And what you also have here is you have 3 ND filters. And the great thing about these ND filters is you can stack these on the anamorphic lens. So what that allows us to do is it allows us to have the exact exposure triangle values that we want, because these can help us adjust the lighting. ND stands for neutral density. And basically that limits the amount of light hitting the sensor on your camera. And when you want to have a certain shutter speed with your frame rate, that's really key, because on bright days, it's going to be overexposed with those slower shutter speeds. Especially if you're doing 24 frames per second with 1/50 as your shutter speed. On a day like today, that would be overexposed. So I went back to 4K 24 and I adjusted our shutter speed to 1/50. And as you can see right there, the exposure value is plus 0.7, which is overexposed. So what I'm going to demonstrate here is I'm going to put the anamorphic lens on. And as you can see, the anamorphic doesn't change the exposure value, but you'll notice it does widen the frame a little bit. Let me do that again to show you. So that's the frame right there without it, and that's the width of the frame with it. You can see it go a little bit wider there. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this ND8 filter. This ND8 filter is probably going to give us enough to get that exposure where we want it. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to clip it on right there. And the ND8 gave us a little more than we needed, took our exposure value all the way down to -2.7. And that's because it's really not bright today at all. So what we can do though is we can offset that with a little bit of a boost for the ISO. So in this case, we would have to boost the ISO to about 400 to get as close to 0 as possible without going over. Now in this case, we are at about -0.7 for the EV value, which is a little bit underexposed, but you'll notice if we go up to ISO 800, we become plus 0.3. You want to get it as close to the EV of 0 as possible without going over. So in this case, 400 is the ISO that we want. This kit for ND filters does also include an ND32 and an ND128. So when I filmed all the sample footage the other day, I filmed in 4K 60 with a shutter speed of 1/120, and I needed the ND32 to balance my exposure. And most of the time I was able to use an ISO of 100 to get that balance. Occasionally I had to do 200 in some of the lower light patches in the woods. If it is a really bright sunny day, and let's say you're at the beach or the desert, you may have to use ND128, especially if you're doing the shutter speed of 1/50 with a frame rate of 24 or 25. But in most cases, if you're doing 4K 60 with a shutter speed of 1/120, that shutter speed is fast enough that you're probably only going to ever need the ND32 or the ND8. Now, I need to also mention the other two filters that are included in here. And one of the other filters is the wide angle filter, but then there's also a macro 40mm filter. Now, macro is going to allow you to get really close to stuff and have that stuff in focus. Now, the macro is generally not going to play a part in cinematic footage, and honestly, I'm probably not going to use that macro much. The wide angle could be helpful in certain scenes if you don't want to use the anamorphic. If you just want to do a little bit wider angle, you could utilize that. But one of the keys with these is the macro and the wide angle, you do have to use them together. And I'll show you what I mean here. So let me show you what happens if we put just the wide angle on. So if we put the wide angle on, you're going to see everything's going to be blurry and out of focus. And that's because the macro has to go on first, even if you're only using the wide angle. So we're going to put the macro on, click that into place. And then the macro, of course, is going to be blurry as well. But then we're going to put the wide angle over top of it. Right there, boom. We have a perfectly in focus frame and everything looks really good with that. So when you're using that, you have to have macro on first, wide angle second, but then you can also stack an ND filter on there. So you can have 3 of these magnetically stacked. And of course, our frame is going to be really dark because I am back at 60 frames per second with a shutter speed of 1/120. So with the lighting today, you actually don't even need the ND filter. With those settings, the lighting actually has perfect exposure right there. In fact, it does say 0.0 for the EV. But what you can do is if you want to use just the macro, you pull off the wide angle. And if you want to be really close to something with the macro, you would just use the macro. And if you do decide to use macro for something, the key to know is that you basically have to be touching whatever object you're filming. That's how close the macro is. So do keep that in mind. And another cool thing about this is with these filters, if you decide to turn off the camera and let it power off, it will normally tuck in, but it'll automatically detect that there's filters on here and it'll rotate the other way. So just take note of that. Most of the time on my hike, whenever I turned off the camera, I didn't care if these were pointing out. I had the filters on there, it protected the main lens anyway. But just take note of that it's not a problem to leave them on and it's not going to hurt the camera. So when you want to attach a lens, it's super easy to do. Because these are magnetized, you don't have to do anything special. You just have to line it up. So I'm going to take the anamorphic right here and just going to hold it close to it and boom, it'll click right into place. And then once you have it attached, it's on there. The magnet's very secure. I haven't had these fall off on me. They do really well. And then if you need to stack a filter, same thing. Just take the ND, hold it close, it'll click right into place. And then when it's time to take them off, what I do recommend is I do recommend hanging on to the gimbal head when you do so. So it doesn't put undue pressure on it, so you're not fighting against it trying to adjust. And then for the macro and wide angle, got the macro right here, click that into place. And then the wide angle is just going to go right over top of it, clicks into place right there. And then if you need the ND filter, number 3, it's going to be the third item. That also clicks into place. And even with 3 of these on here, the gimbal still stabilizes easily, no problem. These are made of metal and they feel nice and rugged, but they're not too heavy for the gimbal head, so I don't have any problems there. So I'm going to go back to the studio and I'm going to show you really quick some of the settings that you need to know when editing. These settings are not complex. It's really easy. It's actually a lot simpler than you might think. And of course, for the anamorphic footage, there's a little bit of an adjustment to make, which is also really easy. We just have to de-squeeze that footage and it's super easy to do in nearly any video editing program. So I'm now going to show you how to edit these anamorphic clips. And I'm going to do this in Premiere Pro. We're going to get Premiere Pro opened here. And we're going to create a new project. I'm just going to call it Pocket 3 Anamorphic. And we're just going to save it in our folder right here where I have the samples. I'm going to click Create. And then we're going to go up here to File, New. And we're going to go to Sequence. And we're going to get our timeline sequence set up. So we're going to go to Settings. I like to do ProRes RAW. And my timeline is 24 frames per second. So I'm going to do 23.976. For the frame size, we're going to do 3840 by 2160. It's going to give us 4K. Working color space, Rec 709. And I like to do maximum bit depth and maximum render quality. And for the codec, I like to use Apple ProRes 422. I'm going to click OK. And next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import some sample clips I have here. So I've got a few from my hiking adventure the other day with these. Import those. And there's a couple things we want to make sure you have available One is the waveform right here. We're going to need that for editing. So you want to go up here to Window, and you want to make sure you have Lumetri Scopes right here. Make sure that's checked. And while you're there, check Lumetri Color as well. We're going to need both of those. And by the way, if you're not using Premiere Pro, some of these steps are going to be different, but the overall settings I'm going to show you today, those will translate to most any video editor. So if you're grading in Final Cut Pro or DaVinci Resolve, the same concepts are going to apply. It's just where you click those is going to be a little bit different. And with the waveforms under Lumetri Scopes, make sure clamp signal is checked and make sure this is set to 10-bit because our footage from the Pocket 3 is 10-bit. All right, so now that we've imported this, we want to select our clips and we want to drop these on the timeline. So I'm going to drag these over. And you may get this error. This is because our footage is 60 frames per second. Our timeline is 24. You can just say keep existing settings and you can ignore that. Now you will notice the footage looks a little flat. That's fine. We're going to do grading and it's going to look really good by the time we're done. But if you film this in anamorphic, there's one step you need to take first. So we're going to go up here to Effect Controls and we're going to go under Scale. And what you want to do is you want to uncheck Uniform Scale, because we need to adjust the vertical scale on this. We need to de-squeeze it a little bit. Right now it's a little bit stretched vertically. So what we're going to do is we're going to uncheck that. And for scale height, you're going to go here and you're going to enter 90. And that is because this is a 1.1x anamorphic lens. And what that means is setting the vertical height to 90 is going to give this the perfect factor. So it's going to be de-squeezed properly and it's going to be exactly how it should be. So once we've done that, you don't have to go through and do it on each of these clips because we can save an effect with the setting and you can then apply it to all of the other clips with one step. So we're going to go up here and we're going to right click where it says motion and we're going to click save preset. And for this preset, I'm going to call it DJI Osmo Pocket 3 Anamorphic, just to make it abundantly clear what this is for. And make sure scale is selected there, then you're going to hit OK. And now if you go to the effects window here, and go under presets, you're going to see this as an option right here. So now if we went to the next clip, we can drop this onto it. Boom, it's going to apply automatically. And the nice thing is you can also select all of the clips that we haven't done it to yet, and you can drop it on any one of them, and you can see them all light up, and it applies it to all of them. There we go right there. If you filmed in widescreen or anything but the anamorphic, you don't have to do this. It'll already be the proper aspect ratios. You only need to do it if you use the anamorphic. So now that we've done that, the next thing we want to do is we want to get an adjustment layer. And our adjustment layer is going to be what we make all of our changes to for grading. So we're going to go to File, New, Adjustment Layer. We're going to keep all the defaults there, hit OK. Then we're going to drag this over top of our footage and we're going to drag it all the way over. So what we're going to do first is we're going to use the LUT that DJI provides. And that is a conversion LUT from D-Log-M to Rec 709. So what we want to do is we want to go over here to Lumetri Color under Creative, under Look, we're going to click Browse, and then we're going to select the LUT. And if you don't already have the LUT, I'll drop a link in the description where you can download the LUT. The LUT is completely free from DJI, and I highly recommend getting it. It's going to help you a lot with this process. So for the LUT, I've already got it right here in my desktop. It's the DJI Osmo Pocket 3 D-Log-M to Rec 709 version 1.cube. And we're going to click Open. So right away, you're going to see the saturation of the colors really pop, and you're going to see some additional contrast that's added there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you before and after applying that. So if I uncheck this, that's the waveform before, and then after applying it, that's after. So you can see it automatically stretches a lot of that. So we don't have a lot of room to work for grading if we let the LUT apply at 100% intensity. But what I like to do is I like to apply the LUT at about 50. We still get the benefits of the conversion, but it's not quite as intense because I want to do a little bit of manual grading and I don't want the LUT to do all of it for me because I want to have a specific look to some of my footage. So after we've applied that, you can see from about 90 to 100 here, there's a gap. That means we can bring up the highlights a little bit more. The highlights are represented by this part of the frame up here. The midtones are in here, and the shadows are in here. And as you can see, this corresponds to whatever is in our frame. You can kind of see those shapes in here, like some of the trees correspond to right in here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go back here to one of our original frames, and we are going to grade this. So for grading, first thing I like to do is I like to go over here to curves, and you don't have to do this through curves. You can do this under basic correction also. But basically, we're going to bring down the shadows a little bit and bring up the highlights a little bit. So I can demonstrate first here in basic correction. We're going to drag the shadows to the left because we want to add some contrast. So this is going to be preferential to what you would like for your footage, and depending on the mood of the scene you're trying to set. But basically, as you drag down the shadows, you want to make sure none of the lines here are getting below 0. If they get below 0, that means you're losing detail in your shadows, and it's just going to be completely black with no detail. So as you can see here, we actually have quite a bit of leeway with the shadows before they hit the bottom. But I don't want to bring them down all that far. I want to go to about -27. And then highlights, same thing. We're going to bring those up. And we want to make sure the highlights aren't going over 100. If I drag it up all the way there, technically nothing's going over 100, but if it did go over 100 up here, you would basically have all white. There would be no detail in the highlights. They would be blown out and it would be all white. But I don't want to bring it up that far. For the highlights in this particular scene, I like how it looks about right there, about 35. And then we want to bring down our blacks a little bit after that. So we want to be careful to make sure nothing goes below 0. If we did that, there'd be quite a bit of it below 0, and we would be losing the detail any place that's below 0 in our scene. So blacks, you want to go kind of subtle here. I recommend doing somewhere around -9. And then white, same thing. We want to bump those up a little bit, but you want to be pretty subtle with that. So I recommend right there about 10. So those are the adjustments if you're doing the basic correction up here. But I like to use curves, so I'm going to show you how to do curves next. So we're just going to reset all of these values by double clicking, put them back to 0. And under curves, we want to use our white line right here. This is going to affect the whole image evenly. It's not going to affect the red, the green, or the blue. There's one adjustment I'm going to make on those in a moment. But first thing you want to do is you want to put a dot right here where the first set of lines cross. This is going to represent our shadows. A dot in the middle, it's going to represent our midtones. And then a dot up here is going to represent our highlights. So what we want to do is you want to drag down just a little bit here. This is going to bring out the shadow detail, and I like it right about there. And as you can see, nothing is below 0 here. We do get close, and then we want to bring up our highlights a little bit, and we want to watch the sky there as we do that. So we have quite a bit of flexibility on the highlights. We can really bring those up pretty far, but I'm going to bring them to about right there. And then we can go back if we want to add a little more shadow, we can do that. It's going to create nice contrast, and contrast is one of the cinematic elements. Anytime you can get contrast in your scene, it's going to make it look even more cinematic, and it's going to help the viewer have a more enjoyable experience watching it. So after I've done that, I'm going to click on this red line here. We're going to adjust our red slightly. What I personally prefer is I like to bring the reds down a little bit in the shadows. It's going to give a slightly green appearance to the footage. Kind of that dark green color. Now you want to be subtle here. If you bring it down too far, as you can see, that's a little bit ridiculous, but I like to bring it down to about right there. And then for our highlights, I like to bring up the red line ever so slightly. It gives us a nice cinematic look already right there. And if you feel like the green is too much, or you don't want to mess with the red line, you don't have to do that. Just double click on these and it's going to take that back. If you just want to adjust the whole image, and the same thing you can do with the green line if you wanted to. So if you want to do some adjustment and make it a little more red in tone, that's how you're going to make it red right there. You click that and bring it down in the shadows. And then you're going to click the line here as well. You're going to bring it up a little bit in the highlights. So that's how you get more of a reddish tint. And then finally, if you click the blue line here and add your 3 dots and bring this down a little bit, this is going to give kind of a more yellow appearance to your footage. And this, by the way, is how you can create your own LUTs too. If you have a certain color that you want to have stand out as an undertone in your footage, like that reddish look here, that's how you would do it. But I'm going to take this back to the default. And then one other adjustment I like to make is down here under the color wheels. I like to bring the midtones up ever so slightly to the red, and the midtones is going to affect skin tones. And sometimes in your footage, if you do one of the curves here, so I'm going to show you again with this, if I make my footage ever so slightly green with that green undertone, you can see how it can make some of the skin tones have that little bit of a green cast. So the way you can work around that to make sure the skin tones are good is you go here to midtones and you want to click on this plus sign and drag it up ever so slightly into the red. And as you can see there, what it does is it makes the skin tones look normal, like they should again. We'll go ahead a little bit here just to confirm. But skin tones look normal, like they should there. They don't have any weird cast to them. That looks like skin tone should look. And if you mess up, like if you go too far up, it's obviously going to look ridiculous. If you go too far this way, it's going to look blue. Over here, that greenish yellow. So wherever you go, you can just double click on the plus sign. It's going to take it back to the center again. So this is our starting point. And I'm going to go up slightly into that red area. I like that right there. And so that's a basic grade of the footage. If you would like to have the blues pop or anything like that, like in the sky, you can do that as well. And you would go back to curves and you would do Hue Saturation Curves. And what you would do is you would click here on the eyedropper and you would select the color you want to fine tune. I'm going to click in the blue. It's going to automatically add dots. And what you want to do is you want to bring the left dot a little bit to the left and the right dot a little bit to the right. And then you can take this middle dot and you can drag it up. And you can see there what it does to the blues. Really makes the blues pop. Now, subtle is key here. Same thing if you brought it down, it would make it more gray with the blues. But this is how you can really fine tune certain colors in your scene. So for the blues, I actually want to make them pop a little more. I'm going to bring it up ever so slightly. And then you can do the same thing with skin tones, by the way. If you click like on my wife's arm here, you can drag this a little bit to the right and this a little bit to the left just to give us a little more stretch. And then you can bring this up slightly. But again, remember subtle is key. You don't want to go all the way up here. That's way too much. But you don't want to go down here either. So if you want to bring it up just a little bit, I like how that looks right there. And you, of course, can check the rest of your scenes to make sure everything looks good there. And I really like how that looks. And of course, you don't have to use the same adjustment layer. If you have some scenes that have distinctly different lighting than other scenes, then you may want to cut up your adjustment layer and fine tune it, which is fine. You also can grade each clip individually. I usually just use the adjustment layer because that's an easy way to have your core grading done. And then if you want to fine tune anything, you can easily do that scene by scene. So right there, I really like how that looks. And it's got our little bit of de-squeeze factor here with the anamorphic, which also looks great. It's those slight black bars. They don't take up a lot of space, but that has a really nice cinematic look. And you can double check over here with your waveforms just to make sure nothing's below 0 and nothing's above 100. Which that also looks perfect there. So that is how you grade the footage from the DJI Osmo Pocket 3 using D-Log-M, and in this case using the anamorphic lens. And then one other key here is when it's time to export, we want to make sure we have the proper export settings. So we're going to go to File, we're going to go to Export, Media, and for uploading to YouTube, generally it's best to use H.264 or H.265. It's up to you. In this case, I'm going to keep it at H.264, and I'm going to go to Video. I'm going to click Match Source. I'm going to go to More. I'm going to select Render at Maximum Depth, use Maximum Render Quality, and down here, I'm going to do VBR 1 pass, and for my bitrate, generally anywhere between about 56 and 85 is going to be good. YouTube, of course, is going to apply some compression to your finished product, but I like to do a minimum of 56 or a maximum of about 85. And of course, the higher the bitrate, the larger your file size is going to be. So if you're concerned about file size, do 56 and you're going to still get great looking footage. And then you can select export or you can select send to media encoder. Either one will export the finished product. So now that you've got all of the tools and tips that you need to know to create that cinematic footage, it's time to get out there with your Osmo Pocket 3 and get creating.